Welcome to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast. Mothers on the Frontline is a nonprofit organization founded and run by mothers of children with mental health conditions to promote caregiver healing, caregiver justice, and children's mental health justice through storytelling. Please note that we are sharing our experiences as mothers. Nothing on this podcast should be considered medical or legal advice.
In this episode, we will discuss the Children's Mental Health Justice Framework, what it is, why it's important, and introduce its 3 principles. We believe that all people have the right to mental health care and mental well-being. Children's mental health justice treats mental health as a vital, integral part of the overall health and well-being of all children, families, and communities. We believe that children with mental health conditions, their parents and caregivers, have the right to genuinely healing care and support that centers the expertise, wisdom, and experiences of our children, families, and communities. The Children's Mental Health Justice Framework, born of the freedom dreams of mothers of children with mental health conditions, is the culmination of our practical wisdom and the articulation of how these experiences have shaped our parental, familial, communal, and citizen identities. The Children's Mental Health Justice Framework is a liberatory framework. It identifies the structures, ideologies, and practices that create obstacles to fully, effectively, and compassionately care for our children. And it identifies the active harms that underpin much of our ill-being. The Children's Mental Health Justice Framework imagines a world in which our children, families, and communities are safe, valued, understood, and respected. A world in which our children thrive because their unique educational, social, emotional, and health needs are genuinely met. It imagines a world in which their beauty, joy, love, compassion, and talents are the focus of their and our existence. It's important that we pay attention to where we derive our inspiration from. We derive and are connected to other justice movements, particularly reproductive and disability justice. We could not have created this framework without the blood, sweat, tears, wisdom, and knowledge shared with us by trans queer folks, people with disabilities, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and especially the women of these movements, our ancestors, mothers, grandmothers, aunties, sisters, and friends. We are humbled by their grace, fortitude, strength, kindness, and love, and strive to uplift their voices with our work. In the spirit of reciprocity and mutual responsibility, we invite you, your families, communities, and ancestors to join us on the discovery, transformation, and healing of our work.
Thanks, Angela, for that.
Thanks.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we came about and how we developed these principles. So Mothers on the Frontline began as a conversation between us, a conversation between friends. And we were friends who had children who had mental health conditions. And so through this conversation, as we know here, we were able to share not only our resources, parenting, access to care, how to manage mental health conditions, but what we found through our conversations was that the conversations themselves revealed and taught us how to think about children's mental health, to deal with the power structures, the institutions, not only doctors, but culture within our families. And it taught us ultimately how to think and engage with our own mental and physical health needs as parents and caregivers. And so these conversations are really what led to the development of Mothers on the Frontline and ultimately our Children's Mental Health Justice Framework. So this framework is founded on three main principles. And these principles developed by us are based on our lived experiences, parenting children with mental health conditions, and conversations with parents who also share the same lived experiences. And these are conversations that we've been having over the past 7 years. Some of them are on the podcast, some of them have been through workshops and group facilitations. And we've had the privilege of engaging with a diverse group of parents and educators and activists and advocates, all who inform these principles. And so I'm going to hand it over to Tammy to talk about the first principle.
Thank you, Dan. The first principle is that children's mental illness, injury, and harms are real and deserving of care. One of the things I think is so fundamental to what we're talking about is that mental health is no different than physical health in its complexity, in the wide range of levels of severity it can have, of complexity of causes. And one thing that often happens is that mental health, particularly in children, can be talked about in a very reductive manner. And so one of the things our framework is attempting to do is get beyond that. So for instance, some mental health conditions can involve a genetic component that, as far as we understand in our current research, for instance, Tourette's syndrome, we believe, has a genetic component, and it has many elements of mental health conditions involved in it that some you might see behaviorally manifest. The most obvious in terms of tics, whether speech or motor, but a lot of stuff's going on internally that other people don't see, and it affects someone's well-being, mental well-being. I think trauma is one that gets a lot of discussion today, and trauma is important. It's something we're going to be talking about a lot in the series. Particularly the work on ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, has been an important development, but we understand trauma in a broader way than I think that initial research did. I think what's exciting is other people and researchers are starting to broaden the concept of ACEs now as well, and we're grateful for that. But children and all human beings of all ages, their mental well-being is affected by trauma, but trauma is also complex and various. So there's physical trauma, brain injury, that's a trauma, right? There's trauma that can happen in the womb. If there's, various things going on, right? So there's physical traumas, I think sometimes we don't think about in this kind of way. There's interpersonal trauma, and that's how the original ACEs work was all framed in interpersonal trauma, particularly in what happens in individual households. But we're also interested in institutional and structural traumas. And so that's something maybe you two can pick up on as well, that all human beings, but children in particular, experience a lot of traumas in structural and institutional ways. I'll mention an example of an institutional trauma, but then I'll let my colleagues give some examples as well. My son has various mental health conditions that have affected his school experience. And he's experienced several school to prison nexus policies that have been nothing less than traumatic for him, and are such that if I employed those at home, would have been considered child abuse, and I could have lost rights to my son if I did them at home, but they're allowed within our public schools and are regularized in our public schools. For instance, he was put in a seclusion room, locked in a room against his will. He was put down in a CPI hold in front of other people, which is a kind of physical restraint. And so these are kind of traumas that are institutionalized and normalized in context of institutions. So that's one kind of example of trauma that doesn't get enough discussion when adverse childhood experiences are discussed.
Yeah, one of the things that when we talk about institutional traumas, and particularly, it always gets me when you talk about your experiences and your son's experiences, because one of the things that I think when we're looking at trauma as only being interpersonal and not trauma as being institutional is we deny the fact that, like, for instance, schools, most of our childhood experiences and most of the time that we spend in community as a child is happening at a school. So it's almost 80% of our development outside of our home is actually happening in the school. And so one of these things in terms of mental illness, injury, and harms are real and deserving of care. And talking about this not only as this interpersonal thing, that it is deserving and necessary. I mean, there's a lot of times as parents, we are not only demanding care, but care is demanded of us, right? Whereas our institutions like school and places where we are placing our children and they're spending most of their childhood, we are not making these same demands of them because we tend to think of mental illness as a personal thing, a private thing. This is what's happening in the family and not a public thing. And this is where structural racism, heterosexism, and structural inequality comes into play. One of the ways that I started talking about this with my students is really looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when we get to that higher end of interpersonal connection, and both for good and for bad, the way that our interpersonal connections can actually heal, they can develop, but they can also harm, then it becomes easier to understand like racism, heterosexism, and these sort of structures that are also creating these personal harms within the family.
Absolutely. And another area where, especially our children that have complex medical needs, in addition to, or maybe exclusive of mental health needs, is the medical system. And I know that our family has experienced a tremendous amount of trauma directly related to medical care and how it's administered, particularly for a child that has, they say, depression and or anxiety on their medical file. Doctors, nurses, other staff immediately chalk up any physical illness symptoms to depression and anxiety and stop, right? And stop the care. And gaslight the children and the family, whether the child is very young or they're an adolescent or teenager or going into adulthood. Get that on your chart. You're just treated so very differently, and you're talked down to, you're not believed, and real physical illnesses go untreated and become much more severe. And the person, the child, just, they have trauma every time they go in. They're like, I don't want to go because I'm not going to be believed. What kind of care am I going to get when I go into a doctor, a hospital, an emergency room? So those are some broad examples of what our families experience when it comes to mental illness, injury, and harms that are real and I think care. Mm-hmm.
And I think this is really, I mean, it does a good job of leading into the second principle, because
Yes.
It's really our experiences at having exactly what you're talking about, being gaslit, our children being gaslit, we being gaslit ourselves as parents, right? When we are seeking care and when we're seeking this relational form of care, because institutions in this first principle do not center children, they don't center parents, and they don't center care. They're centering a whole host of other things, efficiencies, a bunch of things, but not care. And so this leads us to
They center control. Sorry.
they center control, right? Efficiency, because control, I mean, one of the central elements, y'all know I'm in public policy, and one of the central elements in almost all institutional arrangements and the way in which institutions are actually evaluated is efficiency. And efficiency is hand in hand with this need to control, right? Because all of what we're talking about, relationality in forms of, which is in the second principle, is not necessarily in the way in which we measure efficiency, efficient. And so this is where we get sort of this children's mental health justice and caregiver justice are mutually dependent. And, you know, when we were talking in that first principle about children and trauma, right? And trauma that's happening in families. And again, one of the ways that I've started talking about this mutual dependency is also the fact that children can't regulate if adults can't regulate. And the same things, like we often lean into for adults, like the things that like dysregulate and dysregulatory behavior. And then it becomes this sort of mutual cycle, right? And so one of the things that has been most striking to us and most striking to me, particularly as a Black woman, because most of the caregiving in terms of the public caregiving outside of the home, right? So home caregiving constructed as privatized, but the work of caregiving is done by Black and brown women. And it is largely work that is undercompensated for the amount of skill, the amount of patience, the amount of self-regulation it takes to actually care for a child with a mental health condition, an adult who might be ill, an elder person. Requires a lot of skills, both interpersonal, social, and resources. And we don't necessarily give our caregivers, parents and otherwise, resources. We don't give them financial resources. We don't have structural resources to support the work. And so often what's happening is we have people who, because their needs aren't met in that Maslow hierarchy of needs, which means that if you don't have those bottom parts, food, security, shelter, insecurity, you don't have those needs met, it's hard to get to that top part, and it's hard to regulate. And we've charged the people who we don't support in that bottom half. I love that it's a pyramid. We don't give them the foundational support with the most complex and interpersonal work of caring for people who need and our children. So caregiver justice is mutually dependent. We cannot just give kids more services, more money, more. I live in California. We have an abundant mental health bond that is supposed to give more services, more things for kids. And as parents, one of the things we talk about is every time I see more services, more appointments, more, more surveillance, right? More engagement, and nothing to actually support how I'm going to feel myself and how I'm going to support myself, then now you're taking that mutual dependency away and you're destabilizing the caregiver and my ability to regulate. And then I cannot do the really intensive work of parenting from my end, my child in that whole, what we talked about in the invocation, that whole way.
Well, and we talk about this all the time between us about what it takes as a caregiver, right? To do all those things, to navigate all of those services, all of those systems that say you have to do X, Y, Z, PDQ, a whole litany of things to take care of your child. Well, who can do that, right? Is it is it the parent who works outside of the home, right? And the parent who works inside of the home? And actually, all of our caregivers are probably doing both, right? And it usually falls on the mother, right? Not always, but usually with the way our society is structured. And how do you meet those needs? You have to you can't work, maybe, right? Because you've got 5 appointments that you have to go to, travel, the amount of money, the emotional time. I can tell you from my experience as working inside the home, it's exhausting. It is so exhausting, and we don't provide the kind of support that most of the people who are caring for children in the home, whether they be the mother, an outside caregiver, an auntie, a grandmother, the kind of support that they need to really care for themselves, but especially to care for their children and the rest of their family. Because we also know that the other kids have needs, and sometimes they have to come second, third, fourth to the child who has the most physical, emotional, other demands. Tammy, I know you know about that.
I was going to give one statistic. I don't want to cut you off, but because I know you have something to say. But I just, to Angela's point, in California, the caregivers who care in congregate, like foster care settings, just got a raise last year. And so now they're able to earn $15 an hour. And this is California. It's literally the most expensive state. And so they got a raise, and it was a big deal because they were earning, some of them, $8 an hour in 2021, 2020, to do the work of caring. So I just wanted to like put like a monetary stat on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things about each of these principles is they're so rich. There's so much in each of them, and we'll do episodes on each of them. But there are a few things that are involved in principle 2 I want to make sure we address in this brief overview. One of them is that when it comes to children's mental health, their relationship with their primary caregiver is very specific and different than perhaps an adult with a mental health condition, unless maybe the adult has a significant disability and needs a guardian or something like that. But even in that case, most adults and even some teens can do quite a bit of self-advocacy. But when you're talking about young children or children who have either the inability to communicate or severe communication difficulties, pragmatic language difficulties, and so forth, they're unable to navigate their services. And when you're talking about a child with disabilities, the services are extensive, that the needs are extensive, and the services that are needed are extensive. And so the caregiver, usually the mother, or a grandmother or so forth, but often a female identified family member, but whoever that primary caregiver is, they're the only ones who are actually coming in touch with all of the various systems and services that child touches. And so they have a very unique position and knowledge that is important for the child's care. And so that's one of the other elements of why children's mental health justice is so interrelated with caregiver justice. You cannot talk about them separate. Now, that's true of anyone who needs care, but it's especially true of children. The other relationship that's important here is between underpaid caregivers and unpaid caregivers. I will not use the language of unpaid, because right now in our culture, it's not just of paid versus unpaid. Those who are paid, as Dan just pointed out, are incredibly underpaid. And so what often is happening is a family with a certain amount of privilege that might be able to either pay someone to outsource some of the responsibilities and needs that are in the family for the child with disabilities, often that's going to be hiring someone who themselves are not going to be getting the kind of pay and benefits that are required for them to support themselves and take care of their family. And I'm not saying this as the individual families are not giving a good wage. If you are using any programs like Medicaid disability programs, i.e. the people who are coming through and helping your child through the IEP services in schools, and so forth, most of the direct care workers in all of these systems are vastly underpaid. And so they are working at a level of precarity. And when it comes to direct care workers that are working with the most need, they often themselves have significant needs.
Yeah.
Because it goes back to that first principle where we're talking about trauma, right? And poverty creates precarity, and poverty is a trauma. It's a structural trauma. And so when you have caregivers who are living in precarity and living, most of them, I don't know how you can live in California with $15 an hour and not be living at the level of precarity and poverty, then that creates its own internal trauma, toxic stress. All of these things are prevalent, which means that it is affecting the health. It's not only the mental health, but the physical health of folks who are underpaid as well. And these are people who are supposed to be supporting people and families who are already engaged and have their own stresses. And so the fact that there's a lot of leaving, like you're saying, the fact that we can't, if you ever experience like we've experienced, where you have the funding for the service, but you cannot find, this is what's happening in California, you can't find people who do this work because this work is not supported.
Yes. And I think that that brings us well into the third principle, right? Of like, how do we address these things? How do we eventually fix them and or support the people who need it? We listen to them, their lived experiences of the children, the caregivers, the families, and the communities that are affected by these things, that deal with these things every day. Their experience matters. And those things need to be at the forefront of it needs to be the forefront of who's helping to solve the problems, right? Rather than somebody who hasn't experienced it, right? Or who doesn't know what it's like to live in that kind of precarity or deal with structural and institutional racism, sexism, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why we continue to have so many of the problems we do, is because we don't listen to the people who are dealing with these sorts of things.
And I'm gonna, I mean, this is a part of the work that I've grown into, and it's actually helped me expand in the other hats that I wear with the other communities. Is that this idea that lived experiences not only matter and are essential, they are essential to the build. They contain the building blocks and the wisdom, and not just the wisdom, but the experience. These are experts, right? Mm-hmm. And they may not be experts in this sort of meta way of like, here's what I should, but in terms of knowing how and knowing what is happening, centering the experiences of communities and parents and caregivers in what we do next is not only essential, but it actually creates these greater connections. It creates, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, particularly lately, about how we create this kind of collective, right? Because again, the hierarchy of needs, that higher art part of the hierarchy of needs and is about collectivity. Yeah. And it's about interpersonal connections and being listened to, being heard, being understood, and being able to, like, through that, have some agency, right? And it creates, it's powerful. It is powerful. And I think we've witnessed this in sitting in community with people and listening and opening up the space and really flipping methodology and the methods of how we usually enter as experts. Like, oh, well, now let me frame everything for you about what we think is going on. Now I'm going to ask you so I can plug it in, and turning that on its head and listening. I mean, this is, to me, the beautiful part about the framework is this has come from really that third plane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is, and what you were just talking about is so important to how we approach our work and how we interact with the community and other parents and really everything that we do, is that we're not the experts, right? We might be an expert on our experience as a parent of children that have mental illness, but we're here to listen, to share, to gather, to hold everybody else in equal value to our own thoughts and experiences. We're just here to share, not be like we're the experts in the room, right?
Yeah, I think that this third principle is true on so many levels in the work that we do around children's mental health justice. So I just want to give like a couple examples. When it comes to children themselves that are struggling and their behavior is seen as problematic from the adults that are working with them, and from a top-down point of view, assumptions are being made about what their behavior is coming from that are based on stereotypes or paradigms that are not at all engaging the child in what's going on. We often end up with great misunderstandings and actually perpetuate the behaviors we're trying to change. So I'm going to give an example, again, for my son, but a lot of the families that we've talked to, this is like a very common experience. My child is autistic and had struggled with unstructured environments in school, such as physical education classes and lunchrooms are difficult environments for several reasons. One, they're unstructured, but two, they're sensorily attacking. They're very painful environments. They're loud, there's lighting issues, there are all sorts of issues that made them painful for my son and for many other children. And my son started having behaving in ways that were not considered acceptable in the lunchroom, because it was the only way he could get removed from the lunchroom. And they taught him this. He actually kept saying to the teachers in the lunchroom what his therapist told him to say. I am not able to be in this environment right now. May I please go to a quieter environment? All it would have taken is he can eat his lunch with a teacher or with a small group or something like that. Quite an easy thing to set up for a child who has a very significant individualized education plan. This is a quite an easy thing to add to that. But they would keep saying, no, you just need to stay here. You need to wait. You need to wait. So he'd end up doing something that was disruptive enough to make them put him in a CPI hold and bring him to the seclusion room. So it's the only way they would remove him from the space. And as painful as that was, it was less painful than the sensory assault he was having in that moment. Now, if they sat down and asked him what was going on when he was regulated, he could have told them this, because he was telling me and his therapist this all along, but no one would listen to it. So this goes for children and us listening to the children, whether we're the caregivers, the teachers, the doctors, what have you. But this also is true of policy. So my last example is a lot of my energy as a caregiver, both when my child was young and now that he's older, as someone who helps him with his services, is paperwork. And a lot of times, it seems like sometimes systems, like I live in Iowa, and the Medicaid disability systems in Iowa sometimes seem like they have put more energy and work into keeping people off of programs than helping the ones who are on them. And so you'll get letters, and if you don't respond to that letter within 2 weeks, you lose services. But when you call your caseworker to find out about the waiting list you've been on for several years, you find out your caseworker has turned over in that time and never put in the request to get them on the waiting list in the first place. So there's a kind of invisible experience that caregivers have, because the policymakers aren't listening to the caregivers. They're just listening to, well, this is how it's supposed to work, by those who maybe are sending out the forms, but not those who have to fill out the forms. So this idea of having to listen to people with lived experience will change things on many different levels to make them more effective.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you're saying, with policy, because we have a tendency to believe that, and you have a wonderful phrase and you have a wonderful breakdown of this, and I'm sure it'll come up in other podcasts, when you have something that is on the books, but it's not actually there, right? And that's a certain phenomenon that is very consistent with policymakers, and actually, people in my camp who are educators in my camp in public policy are particularly guilty and vulnerable for, because we have to train people to think, look at the data, and any time we're just looking at data. I mean, data is a representation of a certain experience in a certain group and certain things, but it's certainly not the entire thing. And so when we're just looking at the data and we're not looking at what the data is missing, we're just looking at what the data is setting, we tend to dupe ourselves into believing, well, again, like in California, basically all we need, I mean, we have a lot of money, and we literally have built centers that nobody can populate, because we don't have staff, we don't have infrastructure, we don't have any of and no one's gotten the word out to parents. So you'll drive by and it's like, if you happen to be a parent like myself who may be in need, and you call, it's like, well, we have a center, and you go in and it's like, well, it's like front desk and nothing is really happening here. And what am I supposed to do? Because a policymaker said there was a need, but no one listened to the community about specifically what that need and what we actually would need to fill that gap. So I think those are great examples.
Excellent. And I think that's a pretty good place for us to end this podcast today. We'll have so much more to talk about on all of these subjects. And as always, it is so good being in the same virtual space with the two of you.
You as well.
Same here.
You have been listening to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast, copyrighted in 2024 by Mothers on the Frontline. Today's podcast hosts are Deanne Benson-Smith, Tammy Nyden, and Angela Riccio. The music is Old English, written, performed, and recorded by Flame Emoji. For more information on our Children's Mental Health Justice Framework, or to support our work with a tax-deductible donation, go to mothersonthefrontline.org. To listen to more episodes, subscribe to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts.